These are the voices of Latin American cello. Estas son las voces del cello latinoamericano.
Because they don't teach Latin American music to the students, because they don't know Latin American music.
This video was made to pay homage to Juan Orrego-Salas, a Chilean composer, scholar, and the founder-director of the Latin American Music Center at Indiana University, Bloomington, where he was the appointed professor of composition until his retirement in 1987. Orrego-Salas graduated from the Universidad de Chile in 1938, where he studied architecture as well as piano and composition. In 1944, aided by Rockefeller and Guggenheim grants, Orrego-Salas traveled to the United States in order to continue his studies in musicology, ethnomusicology, and composition at Columbia University and Princeton University. Throughout his life, Orrego-Salas was an avid advocate for Latin American music around the world. Now, more than half a century later, the Latin American Music Center remains an important part of the Jacobs School of Music at Indiana University.
Welcome to the Voices of Latin America, the YouTube channel associated with the Sphinx catalog of Latin American cello works. My name is Germán Marcano, and I am co-author of the catalog together with Dr. Horacio Contreras. I always feel grateful when we have the opportunity to talk to the general public about the lives and achievements of special musicians that are not very well known but have made a real difference in our lives as Latin American musicians. Today, we want to remember the wonderful Chilean composer Juan Orrego-Salas and talk about his extraordinary career with two distinguished musicians that knew him quite well and accompanied him in some of his ventures, seeking the deserved recognition for Latin American music in the US and the rest of the world. They are the Latin Grammy nominee professor of composition at Michigan State University, the Venezuelan Dr. Ricardo Lorenz, and Dr. Pablo Mahave-Veglia, extraordinary Chilean cellist and teacher, professor at Grand Valley State University in Michigan, both very dear friends of mine for many years. I would like this wonderful guest to talk about Orrego-Salas in various aspects of his personal and professional life, his musical style, his collaboration with soloists, his humanity, and his outstanding legacy to the Latin American music world. First of all, I would like to ask Dr. Ricardo Lorenz about his relationship with Maestro Orrego-Salas and about his significant legacy.
What a great opportunity to give an overdue recognition to Juan Orrego-Salas, Germán. Thank you so much. I was fortunate to have coincided with Juan Orrego-Salas when I decided to go to Indiana University in Bloomington to study originally piano, but of course that was an excuse to really study composition. I really did not know Juan Orrego-Salas when I went there. And it was once I got to Indiana that I was, just by an amazing coincidence, assigned to sing in the university chorale. And I tell this story because it's really impactful and important in my life. So not knowing who Juan Orrego-Salas was, as a freshman at Indiana University, I was thrust into singing in the choir of his Misa in Tempo de Discordia, which is a masterpiece of Latin American music, a work that sets into conflict the religious literature and the doubts about religion in one breath. So, not knowing who Juan Orrego-Salas was, I was actually singing his music and becoming very acquainted with details about his music. And it was only after we did the premiere that backstage I was able to meet the man. And I took the courage to tell him that I was so impressed with his music. I was so grateful that one day I would love to be able to study with him. And Juan Orrego-Salas pat me in the back and said, "Seguro, seguro, hijo, seguro. Un día, seguro." So that's the way our relationship started. And it went from that to practically Juan becoming a mentor, almost a surrogate father for me as I was while I was in Bloomington, as well as his wonderful wife, Carmen Orrego-Salas. So I had the virtue for many years to be able to really live very closely to the entire family and not only learn about composition, but also learn about life and about family through him.
What do you think is his most important legacy?
I put it in basically two categories. One is, of course, the reason why we're here is something like a catalog of Latin American cello music. He is maybe a pioneer, not only in the United States, but in the world, a pioneer of collecting, sampling, and analyzing and disseminating Latin American art music to the world. And he did it, of course, through, as you said in the introduction, by founding through the Rockefeller Foundation's funding the Latin American Music Center. So that's one big part of his legacy, is the collection and the network he created around that center, which still exists to this day and is very healthy. And the other legacy is, of course, of him as a composer, of extraordinary composer. I would say that unlike other composers in Latin America, Juan Orrego-Salas, I would call his style something like Spanish revival, or modernist Spanish revival. So he looked at Latin American music from the lens of the influence that Spain had in Latin America, more than, for example, Africa had in Latin America, or the native culture had in the music of Latin America. And he did it in a very unique way and with extraordinary craftsmanship. So he has really two legacies. Of course, encompassing both is the fact that he had many pupils that after studying with him or being influenced by him in Indiana, went out to the world and continued to disseminate his knowledge.
This wasn't an organization that was going to last 5 years only. They wanted to be sure that it was going to progress beyond that. I told Dean Bain, research, I think that the center needs to be strongly connected with the musicology department of the School of Music. Promotion should be done on the basis of programs presented at the School of Music. We could think of festivals or isolated programs of a selection of good Latin American music. And this, then, to interest in teachers of instrument and voice in the repertory of Latin American music, because they don't teach Latin American music to the students, because they don't know Latin American music. I remember that Bain asked me, well, and how would you call this? Latin American Department of Music? No, I wouldn't call it department. Perhaps Latin American Center. Oh, I like that. Latin American Music Center. Yes, that's it. And there we decided, you see, that that's what we were going to call this organization. And that's the way it became finally part of Indiana University School of Music.
Although our catalog of cello music from Latin America makes reference to 10 works written by Maestro Orrego-Salas, including the only composition I know for the unusual combination of cello and tuba. When we searched the internet for videos and recordings of his pieces, we only found 2 of his works. Duos concertantes for cello and piano, performed by myself and my sister Clara, and a reduction of the cello concerto, opus 104, same opus as the Dvorak's famous cello concerto, performed by my guest Pablo Mahave-Veglia and the wonderful Chilean pianist Paulina Zamora. I believe Dr. Mahave-Veglia is the most authorized person in the world to talk about his cello concerto. What can you tell us about Orrego-Salas' cello concerto?
First of all, thank you for having me. It's a very humbling experience to to be not only paying homage to somebody as incredibly epoch-making as Juan Orrego-Salas, but in such distinguished company. I'll tell my story of the origin story that Ricardo just told. I think is quite evocative. I have my own. Of course, being not only Chilean, but having grown up in a family of musicians. My mother was the piano professor at the University of Chile for many years. The name of Orrego-Salas was always, I've never met the man, but we all knew who he was, of course. So I knew by the time I went to do my master's at Indiana University, which was, mind you, in the mid-1990s. By then he had been retired, although I knew he lived in town, he had been retired for several years. And I had actually never played the entire Duos Concertantes, but I played a couple of them because it's a set of character pieces that you can actually take apart and play individual pieces. And I loved them. I found them so rhetorical and so self-contained. And it was, but when I was a student at Indiana, within seems like hours of getting to Bloomington, we get invited for a tecito, a little social occasion, to the house of Alfonso Montesino, wonderful Chilean pianist that also taught at Indiana University for roughly about the same time as Mr. Orrego-Salas. And who should be there by Juan Orrego-Salas? I was, of course, completely starstruck. I don't think I could get a word out. And rather than exploiting this status difference, he was the kind of man to do the opposite, to find a connection with somebody that was clearly so muted in the sheer impression of meeting him. And he was extremely welcoming, and he invited us over to his house at some point, and we became part of this sort of extended family circle. He had an incredible, personable, and gregarious and affable personality in this regard. Mostly Latin American students, not exclusively, but as I like to say, the Chilean colony was very small, and Paulina and I were part of it, and so we ended up at his house many times. A few years later, by the time I was finishing my master's, he mentioned to me one time that he was writing this cello concerto, and as luck would have it, within the catalog, it was going to be Opus 104, the same opus as the Dvorak concerto, which gave, at that point, I had just gotten my master's. I'd been studying with Janusz Starker, the great Hungarian-born virtuoso, and he thought no better idea than to premiere the concerto and play the Dvorak in the same program, which is something only Mr. Starker would have thought of doing. And in fact, in the program, I went to the concert. They also did the Haydn Symphony, which is Opus 104. So it was an Opus-themed party. I was at the concert, and the playing was exciting. The work, I was very impressed with the piece. And in fact, it's the kind of piece that I thought, I really like the piece. I bet you I will love it the fifth or sixth time I hear it. It is that kind of work where there's some stuff underneath, it's just hiding some features that you think you can discover later. And by then I had just graduated. So I approached Mr. Orrego-Salas upon seeing the music, and he could not have been more welcoming and more appreciative of my interest. And in fact, he said to me, you know what, I need to edit this piece. We had some problems with the part. Mr. Starker had several suggestions. Would you come over and help me rework this thing? And I was absolutely thrilled. And I went to his house several times. There was a lot of editing that he did. In fact, and there's one recording of that premiere performance, which is, I think, pretty 5-6 minutes longer than the version that he ended up with after the editing. Mostly orchestra interludes, but not exclusively. And Mr. Starker edited the cello part in some technical aspects, and I added a few things that I think made it a little more idiomatic. And there was this great moment. This is in 1994. I was 25 years old, and we're working on this thing, and the phone rings. And he goes to the phone, and he starts speaking in Spanish with somebody that he referred to as Pepe, which is a common nickname in Spanish. And by the way of him talking, he's obviously talking to a Chilean person by the vernacular that he's using. And I could hear the conversation from the other room. At some point, I go and have my little tea or whatever he had in the other room. And I could hear some of the conversation, and he's describing American academic life. So he talks to this person for half an hour, comes back, and we work more. And I'm dying to know what's going on with this phone call, but I'm too afraid to ask. So we work on the concerto and blah, blah, blah. In the evening, I'm going to take my bike. I was still biking. I was going to take my bike back into town. And I just had to ask, who was that on the phone? And he said, oh, that was Jose Donoso, the Chilean writer. And apparently he's adding some details about American academic life in his next book. And he just wanted to know some stuff. So the fact that he would be on the speed dial of the literary minds, the likes of Jose Donoso, and then that he would be so not inclined to name drop in any kind of way, to me is very telling of his personality, how well read he was, how cultured, the kind of influence and the kind of people that he collaborated with. A couple of years later, I actually pulled it out of my shelf here. The book is Donde van a morir los elefantes, Where Elephants Go to Die. It's about a Chilean intellectual that finishes his academic life in the United States. It's actually a pretty dark and a fairly funny book, but there are a lot of details about sort of rural campuses, the likes of which, of Bloomington, Indiana, that I don't think Donoso would have known anything about, and there's some clear research from Orrego-Salas in there. In 2013, I thought, my one regret is I had never done a performance with orchestra. And the more I got to know the piece, the more I absolutely loved it. And the more, to me, it seemed, even Mr. Starker actually mentions this in his memoirs that he published shortly before he died. He mentions that the premiere had not been successful and that he wishes he had more input into the solo part. I think I know what he means. The cello part is not flashy. It's not a virtuoso vehicle. It's very difficult, but the difficulty doesn't come from breakneck speed or pitch bending dynamics or anything that is very flashing or very sexy, for lack of a better word. The register changes are very torturous sometimes, which can be in itself very expressive. And the gestures are, for the most, very rhetorical, very charged, and very minimal. And I don't mean minimal in the musical style of sort of uniform indifference, but very minimal in the less is more kind of thing. And even if you have time to go towards the end of the first movement, from minute 6 to the end, it goes into the cadenza. And you finally think, oh, here we go. The melodies have been, like I said, this unfolding registers that are very torturous and very lyrical. And it gets to the cadenza. This is where he's going to unleash the hounds, as it were, right? And no, it actually becomes more notes surrounding silence. And the cello part becomes more abstract, sort of the opposite of now I'm going to impress you because I'm alone, but rather now I'm going to be even more intimate because I'm alone. And then the end of the cadenza, the cello goes into the high register with this little arpeggios that invites very gently the orchestra to come back in, very minimally. And then when that coupling is achieved back together, the cello plays this very lonely open C pizzicato, and now it's done. It's like accomplishing the most with the least words. And it's something I think I understood when I was 25, but now I really appreciate it and I really love it.
Great. You've been talking about his general music style, I mean, from the performer's point of view, but it will be very interesting to see what a composer like Dr. Lorenz has to say about his musical style.
Well, it was very interesting to hear Pablo talk about the cello concerto, which, by the way, I was there when the Starker premiered it in Indiana. I just remember the gist of the moment. And you're right, it struck me the same way that many of his works strike me, and you were getting to that, Pablo, and that, you know, his music is not ornamented. He was an architect. He actually wanted to show the clear, transparent engineering of music without any ornamentation. And I see what you mean by being rhetorical and not rhetorical. I think Juan just was very straightforward. So Orrego-Salas, as I said earlier, I like to think of him as, for lack of a better term, a modernist Spanish revivalist, where again his music has always that elegance that you find in neoclassical music, and has the cadence of, you know, you can even think of the music of Falla on occasions, but then he can turn very, very modernistic, especially around the years, 1960s and 70s, where he starts exploring uses of scales with overlapping diminished chords. And then his music gets very hermetic and very inward looking, as opposed to earlier music from the 1940s and 50s, which is very open and modal. And you can hear a clear contrast between the music that he wrote in the 50s versus the music he wrote in the 60s and the 70s. And I never got him to tell me, why that changed, why he went from modal and versions of modal harmonies to just plain relying on octatonic scales and diminished arpeggios for his music. And you can see that in the cello concerto, among other pieces. It's abundant. That's the impact that Juan Orrego-Salas' music had on me as far as the style is. It's just clarity of phrase. You can clearly see his architecture, non-ornamented, and also a preponderance, especially the latter part of his music, on uses of octatonic and diminished scales. And he did it in a very personal way.
What do you think, Dr. Lorenz, is the most important lesson he taught you?
The most important lesson is to love deeply and sincerely, and be very spiritual. It's as simple as that. He really did. And I saw it not only in the love of his craft, but in the love of his wife, the love of his family, the love of his students. And it was a very reserved type of love, but that's his biggest lesson to me.
I didn't know, you see, that this was going to extend the way it extended. First of all, I didn't know the School of Music of Indiana University. I knew that it was a very important school of music. But I was surprised, not only by the friendship of my colleagues in the faculty, but by the way things were done here. The important that all genres of music were part of the education, and that my duty as a director of this new department within the School of Music was to extend this to the field of the Latin American countries.
Well, as you say, Dr. Mahave, you were a student when you met him in Bloomington. You tell us a little bit about how you met and the way he welcomed you in the community. Can you tell us something about his personal side as a mentor and as a guide?
Music can be, especially when you're a student, can be very hierarchical. in academia too. So students can feel very removed and very inaccessible to faculty. And to me, Orrego-Salas just broke down those firewalls. And it was such a welcoming embrace of us and Paulina and other people that were there at the time into his house. And I saw that as a student, and the opportunity as a 25-year-old to work on this piece with him. And even if I've never played it again, just the insight to work with a composer and to see how they can change their minds and listen to the music anew in the moment is so meaningful. This music was so not predetermined. That's how it seemed to me. It had an architecture, it had a point, but he was so free and so open to changing his mind about nuances because of something you heard in the moment, which I think is really humbling for a performer. Years later, in 2013, I wanted to, in fact, that had been my point, that maybe this concerto would fit better as a chamber, not a chamber piece, but with a smaller orchestra. The instrumentation of the piece is rather large: trombones, tuba, percussion, harp, the works. And yet, all of these instruments are used in very small portions. And I wrote him about it, and he was so incredibly kind and so thoughtful, and he basically said no. Which is really interesting. He had an idea of this piece being grand, not because it was getting into this incredible engine and putting the pedal to the metal and using every ounce of energy of the engine, but because it was available. The colors that he wanted were that big, even if it didn't sound monumental and overpowered. So he actually did shoot me down, actually, in a way, but in a very kind way. So I asked him about trying to work a piano reduction that was more, he had done one, but to his own admission, his own piano reduction, he referred to it as an amplification, which is the opposite of a reduction. He left nothing out. So Paulina and I worked on doing a piano reduction, and then we went to Bloomington back in 2013. I couldn't believe it. He was 94, 95 years old at the time, sharp as a tack, vital. In fact, I asked him what music he was working on, and he was, oh, no, my mind doesn't work like that anymore. I can't write music. So I just been busy working on my memoirs. That was his mental decline, was writing his memoirs. And that moment, to me, it was very meaningful and very Orrego-Salas in this understated.
Wow, what a great man. What a great stories. And, I really feel privileged to be here talking to you from first-hand knowledge of this great master. It is very important to always reach out on the legacy of great people like him, in order to learn and improve and try new ideas in our careers and our personal projects. I would like to ask each one of you, what can the Sphinx catalog of cello music learn from the pioneering work that he did as a founder and director of the Latin American Music Center at the University of Indiana, Bloomington?
I think you're doing it. I mean, he sweated passion, Germán. He was almost a militant advocate of Latin American composers and music. And something I should have also mentioned regarding one of the biggest lessons that I learned from him is to be aware of your surroundings and to be aware of social, political causes. And I don't mean the Sphinx catalog is going to be, a place where social and political causes are going to be addressed. But in a way you are. Every time you do one of these interviews, and you have done so many of them, the Sphinx catalog, you're making a statement about a certain worldview, a certain viewpoint, which is very particular, and that is the Latin American worldview. So the only thing I suggest is, continue doing what you're doing in such a passionate way and with such conviction, because that's one of the lessons I also learned from Juan Orrego-Salas.
In fact, I was about to say the same thing. You're already doing it. His love and devotion to that institutional memory, to cataloging, is something that you basically bring into life. And what an important mission that is. We hear so much about inclusion. And in that sense, this man was way, way ahead of his time, right? Those seem to be keywords of high currency now, but 30, 40 years ago when academia was, let's face it, a lot wider than it is now, he was saying, these are subjects, these are topics that are not only worth of scholarly research, are integral part of the academic world. And this would not have been easy to do currently. Imagine what it was in the 1960s and 70s to get the Latin American Music Center started in a mainstream institution like Indiana University, where to a large degree still there is that equivalency of scholarly purity with white European males. And for him to forge a different path and include that and widen the scope of academia and what is worth of scholarship, we all stand on those shoulders, for sure.
Yeah, if I may add something that I think the Sphinx catalog can help to complement what Juan Orrego-Salas did at the Latin American Music Center, and that's to be very inclusive about what we call Latino and Latinx right now, which is a complex category. But the point being that during Juan Orrego-Salas' time, he devoted his time to bridge Latin American artists and composers with the United States, but as though Latin American composers were these entities that lived outside of the United States. But now we have so many artists who are Latino descent, whether born here or Latin America, that need to be included in these initiatives. And you are doing that already. Because right now the world is completely different. What we call Latino, Hispanic, Latinx encompasses the entire continent, not only composers living or raised in Latin America. So I think that's that complementary part that the Sphinx catalog is taking care of right now, to include also composers who were born in the United States, but who have Latino heritage.
Well, thank you very much. I must say that when I started to do this research back in the 1998, 99, one of the big sources was the catalog from Indiana University, Latin American music from Indiana University. That was my first source. And most of the design of the information on every piece follows roughly the information that is on the catalog of Indiana University. And that catalog was, of course, part of his legacy as the chief and the commander of that great institution. So thank you very much to our special guests, Dr. Ricardo Lorenz and Dr. Pablo Mahave-Veglia, Ricardo and Pablo, my friends, great artists involved with the Latin American music scene, especially that of the cello. It has been a pleasure and a privilege to have you in this conversation. The two of you are living testimony of the legacy of the great Juan Orrego-Salas, exemplary Latin American musician that present and future generations should know.
Thank you, Germán. And Pablo, what a great pleasure to see you again and talk to you and hear your fantastic stories. Thank you.
Likewise. It's been an honor. Thank you.
Please follow the catalog and the Sphinx and Cello Bello websites and our social media accounts on Facebook and Instagram, in which we post regularly issues related to Latin America and our wonderful instrument, the cello. I'm looking forward to have another talk to you soon.
Great. I hope so. Gracias, hermano.
Gracias a ti.
Gracias, amigos.